모든 조약 또는 협정이라고 하는 것들이 원천적으로 무효다. 당초부터 무효다라고 하는 게 우리의 입장입니다. 그러니까 법적인 질서가 없는 상황에서 식민지 지배가 이루어진 거죠. 그래서 불법적인 식민 지배 질서라고 하는 게 우리의 입장인 겁니다. 기본조약 제2조에 대한 해석은 우리는 그렇게 해석을 하고 있습니다. 그런데 일본 쪽은 병합에 이르는 그 모든 조약은 성립 당시에는 유효했다라는 거죠. 그러나 일본이 패망해서 한반도에서 나감으로써 더 이상 유효하지 않게 되었다라고 하는 것이 일본의 입장입니다. 이게 제2조의 내용이에요. 그러니까 이 제2조의 내용을 우리의 입장에서 확정하지 못한 거는 일본이 만들어 놓은 식민 지배 질서, 그다음에 우리가 일본으로부터 해방되면서 맞이했던 냉전적인 패권 질서를 온전히 극복하지 못한 것을 의미하는 겁니다.
60 years ago, with the conclusion of the Korea-Japan Treaty, the 1965 framework of Korea-Japan relations was established. The normalization of diplomatic relations between Korea and Japan was certainly an achievement worthy of high praise. However, from Korea's perspective, the 1965 framework was one it had to accept without having fully overcome its colonial past. And today, 6 decades later, conflicts and challenges rooted in this very framework still remain.
일본에서 반드시 사죄하고 해결해야 됩니다.
Korea and Japan, at what crossroads are we at now?
Hello and welcome to our special live coverage of the summit between South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung and Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. Today we're carrying live scenes from Japan as the delegation from Seoul led by President Lee arrives in Tokyo today. The summit is expected to include expanded talks between the two countries' delegations. Now, while we wait for that to start, for more on bilateral relations between the two countries, here in the studio, I have Dr. Kim Mi-kyung, Senior Researcher at Gyeongsang National University. Dr. Kim, welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much for having me.
And for more on the economic perspective of the summit, I also have Professor Yang Hee-dong, Professor of Business Administration at Ewha Women's University. Professor Yang, thank you. So, Dr. Kim, let's start with you. It's the first time in 2 years that a South Korean president is visiting Japan, and it's unusual for a Korean leader to meet the Japanese Prime Minister before meeting the U.S. president, right? Could you tell us more about the significance of today's visit?
Yes, the timing of the summit meeting between Korea and Japan is very significant for its practical as well as symbolic significance. As we know, this year, the year of 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of Korea's liberation from Japanese colonial rule, while this year also marks the 60th anniversary of the normalization of diplomatic relations between the two countries. So this dual commemoration occurring this year means that both countries can be ready to go beyond the past, which was very difficult, particularly on the part of Korea, to go beyond the past difficulties, while the 60th anniversary means that both countries can move beyond and go forward by addressing some of the issues that have been lingering in this part of the world. So, in order to accentuate those duality of these commemorations, there were events, for instance, like last February in Tokyo and in Seoul, there was joint light ceremony that was Tokyo Tower and Seoul Tower lit up the lights at the same time after making concerted commemorative efforts. And that was interesting and fun commemorative event. And also last June, I시바시게루, the Prime Minister of Japan, also mentioned during the 60th commemorative event that the future is bright and both countries can tackle the challenges of modern day era, such as declining birth rates and shrinking size of populations of both countries together. So by sharing the common challenges, it's also by making collective efforts to celebrate the 60th anniversary of normalization talk. Both countries have been making efforts to go beyond and to move forward together. So, I mean, this year, I think carries profound and historical significance in terms of practical terms as well as symbolic domain.
Right, historic milestone for their bilateral relations indeed. And Professor Yang, what would you say is the #1 economic goal that President Lee Jae-myung plans to achieve through today's summit?
Well, you know, the tariff has been the major backdrop to this entire week of diplomacy. So absolutely, tariff is a major agenda for this summit. And, you know, since April 2025, Washington has imposed a 10% baseline on, you know, the under the AAPA, with the higher and the sector-specific rate, such as 25% on autos and 50% on steels and aluminum. And Tokyo has been holding repeated briefings on its consultations with the U.S. of all these measures. So given that information, and President Lee's Tokyo lab was framed by the outlet like AP as a preparation to navigate all these tariff environments. So, and it'd be really, really surprising if the tariff are not to this agenda. So we can expect any discussions that link the tariff with the trilateral, the value chain coordinations on like AI or chips and batteries, even the critical minerals. So absolutely the economic issues, economic preparations to navigate all this, the tariff environment should be and must be the major agenda for today's summit.
Right, absolutely. Tariffs will definitely be on the agenda today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, and Dr. Kim, what diplomatic and security agenda might be on the agenda for the summit today?
Since both countries are trying hard to cooperate with each other by going beyond the past difficulties, they are clearly and obviously, and they have to explore economic cooperation and security coordination. In terms of economic cooperation, since President Lee is expected to hold summit meeting with American President Trump, Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba can probably share negotiation tips with him because Prime Minister Ishiba dealt with challenging and so-called tough Trump administration over the tariff negotiations. So probably those two leaders can talk about what to expect and how to tread the precarious waters. And Prime Minister Ishiba can be helpful for President Lee. And on security terms, Pyongyang's getting close with Russia and its insistence on nuclear power, nuclearization, and self-proclamation of nuclear power, all these, I think, are making both leaders a bit nervous, and they will try to explore many options to control North Korea's nuclear ambition for the sake of regional peace and stability. So those issues, I think these two leaders are going to talk about and talk to each other.
Right, definitely. Negotiation tips to handle the Trump administration will definitely discuss at the summit. And Professor Yang, it seems South Korea and Japan are both looking to expand economic cooperation and deepen economic ties. What are some areas that the two countries might be able to work on? Oh,
there are too many issues. First of all, we can think about the semiconductors. And the Washington tries to reshore all those manufacturing facilities and equipments back to the United States. And they decided to purchase the stocks of Intel, and they try to enhance their influences on the governance of Samsung or even the Hynix. So absolutely, they want to hold a tight control of global supply of the semiconductors. And Japan and Korea, even including Taiwan, must be the major partners for this intensive global strategy of the Washington. And the second issue, the critical minerals. And everyone knows that China has all this significant amount of critical minerals for the batteries and the electric vehicles. Even though we know that there are some the minerals available within the United States, but absolutely the lopside is in favor of China. So they want to advance their mining to the South America. But Korea and Japan need to expand their coverage of and oversupply of these minerals, entire value chains of making chips and the batteries. And third issue is the fishery and agriculture products. This is a very, very sensitive and critical issue because Korea plans to get join the CPTPP, but this is a very, very globally the open economy measures. And one of the critical requirements is to open up the even fishery and agriculture market. Korea really strictly bans the import of Japanese, the fisher product from 8 prefectures. And it could be really, the headache discussions and agenda between two summits.
Right, a lot of economic issues there indeed. Yeah. And Dr. Kim, historical issues remain as critical thorns in bilateral relations. And last week, Prime Minister Ishiba used the term regret in a World War II memorial speech for the first time in more than a decade and 13 years. What are your thoughts on this?
Actually, that was a very interesting moment when Japanese Prime Minister dropped the word of regret for various reasons. First, if he used conciliatory and pro-South Korean words such as regret regarding historical issues, it was very obvious that his support base, which is conservative factions of the Japanese society, would not be happy with it. So that means he might lose some votes by expressing regrets. But he did it anyway. So we should ask this question of why. And I think it had something to do with his strategic calculation where he wanted to help President Lee Jae-myung by providing certain kind of conciliatory and fence-mending gesture so that President Lee can calm his own support base in domestic politics in South Korea. So Prime Minister Ishiba's word, I think, was strategically calculated gesture in order to help South Korean leader at the cost of his support base in Japan. So that was a highly strategic diplomatic act on his part. And another thing that I like to point out is that the word of regret is actually milder in its connotation and emphasis vis-a-vis other words like responsibility, apology, right, or remorse. So in order to make the upcoming summit talk at that timing to proceed more smoothly, I think he chose the word with great consideration, without using very strong alternative words such as apology, responsibility, remorse. He still delivered the message to the Korean public so that we can stay in support of President Lee, while he tried not to provoke too strongly over his domestic support base. So that was, I think, a wise choice on his part for the sake of bilateral relations.
I see a lot of strategic calculation included in that action, right?
Yes, in one word.
Right. And also, Dr. Kim, President Lee Jae-myung also told a local Japanese news outlet that it would be undesirable to scrap past deals on wartime issues like sex slaves and forced laborers. How does this policy towards Japan differ from the previous Yoon administration?
We have quite a bit to say about what was happening under previous Yoon Suk-yeol administration. Right. I mean, there were moments when the Korean people went like, what? Why is this happening? What's the logic behind this policy change? And that means former President Yoon, who is now impeached, was excessively conciliatory. What do I mean by excessive? He didn't seem to factor in the fundamental principle of diplomatic affairs, which is to serve national interest. A lot of people couldn't figure out how his stance towards Japan over historical issues could serve Korea's interest. So he was excessively warm-hearted or conciliatory towards Japan. And I like to describe it as it was an era of diplomatic anomaly. That was not business as usual. So we can expect quite a bit of difference between the current administration of Lee Jae-myung and the previous administration. But one thing we need to keep in mind is that President Lee has made it very clear that he is going to honor and uphold the agreements made between Korea and Japan over historical issues. And he emphasized this word of promise. Bilateral agreement is a promise made by two countries, and this promise is to be honored and respected. And he's not going to break away from the fundamental rule and norm of diplomatic affairs by reverting those agreements on comfort women and forcibly mobilized Korean laborers during the wartime to previous status. So he is going to be different from Yoon in terms of his fundamental principles, strategic calculations, but he is not going to rock the boat by breaking the promises that are already made between the two countries.
Right. So during the Yoon administration, what he did in March, I think that was last year with the forced labor, that was definitely a conciliatory gesture to Japan, and it seems he is also trying to, sort of tackle that historical issues while also saying that he wouldn't scrap past deals with Japan.
Right.
So, Professor Yang, in the same interview with the Japanese newspaper, you already mentioned this earlier, but President Lee also talked about his intention for Korea to join the CPTPP, like you mentioned. What are your thoughts on this, and could you just briefly explain what that deal is and how significant that would be to South Korea?
Well, I do believe that it is very plausible for Korea to join the CPTPP this time because, well, actually, TPP used to consist of 12 countries, including the United States. But in 2017, the United States decided to withdraw from TPP, and its name is changed to a Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, having 11 member countries. Well, the President Lee already mentioned, and very, very clearly and vividly implied that the Korea will join this CPTPP. And in May this year, I mean, there were the ministers' meetings in Jeju Island. And from the official announcement, there was a very clear message that Korea will join this agreement and all the members will welcome, right, Korea as a new member of this agreement. Well, the remaining issue, a very critical issue, is the CPTPP pursues and declares very open-minded and very proactive free trade, free economy in the global scale. So that means, as already mentioned, Korea may have to open up the fishery and agriculture market to all those 11 members of CPTPP. And very sensitive issue, again, remains fishery products. And Japan has asked and urged Korea to lift the curbs on the banning of the fishery product from the Japan's 8 prefectures. And they passed all the measures and all those ALPS-based water relays will also satisfy the international standards. But Korea still maintains a very strict ban over the import of Japanese fishery products. It will remain a very sensitive issue because it is the matter of a political agenda for both of Japan and Korean the summit. So let's see how this issue is resolved from this issue, but it'll be very, very interesting to watch over the resolution of this issue.
Right, we'll have to see how that plays out. And Dr. Kim, we just talked about historical issues. Could we expect the two leaders today to possibly agree on a joint declaration or some sort of joint statement that addresses wartime historical issues that will possibly be similar or more than what we saw during the Kim Dae-jung administration, the Kim Dae-jung Obuchi Declaration.
You know, Unji, I do not know for sure, but let me speculate. And my speculation is that a new comprehensive joint declaration between the two countries, I don't think that's going to happen. Why? Because President Lee has already stated that he's going to uphold the previous agreements and he's going to respect those agreements, no matter how much disagreements or concerns him personally or Korean public in general might have. He says that the promises were made and he's going to keep it. So at this time and stage, issuing a new comprehensive joint declaration in order to address historical issues, I don't think that's likely. But if a certain kind of statement, such as joint statement between the two countries, I think is more likely. And what then could be included in the possible potential joint statement? I think something very general, something not too provocative or conservative, such as acknowledgement of existing agreements and frameworks, focusing on future-oriented partnership between the two countries, an emphasis on shared security and economic cooperation, and very, very general reference to the context of such joint statement if it is going to be produced in very general terms. So nothing too dramatic, nothing too controversial. Those general issues on security, economy, mutual respect, abidance by the already existing frameworks and agreements, those things I think are along the line.
I see. So although Prime Minister Ishiba used the word regret for the first time in more than a decade, we won't be able to see anything dramatic or crucially that will impact bilateral relations and the historical issues, I guess, right?
You know, I mean, as we have discussed already, as we are beginning this panel, you know, this year marks 2 anniversaries. But when you look at the contents of those 2 anniversaries, they are contradictory. The 80th anniversary was about Korea's liberation from brutal Japanese colonial rule. But 60th anniversary is what we could achieve in that historical context for both countries to go beyond, to prosper together. So if these 2 countries of Korea and Japan issue a joint declaration reopening the old wounds of historical grievances, by mentioning topics like sex slaves or wartime forced laborers and the problems of previous agreements, it's not going to fly too well. And I don't think the leaders of both countries are willing to take that risk by opening the old wounds, by issuing a new statement. But, you know, like joint statement emphasizing friendships, mutual cooperation, the necessity to tackle common challenges would be more like the direction that the leaders might want to take. And of course, this is my personal observation, and we don't know what's going to happen after these 2 leaders have met. But this is what I think for now.
I see. I guess we'll have to see how the summit turns out today.
Yes.
And Professor Yang, you briefly mentioned this earlier, but President Lee also said on this, the import of seafood products, he said public trust is needed in order to sort of ease restrictions on Japanese seafood imports. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it'd be really tough because, as I already mentioned, and Korea has maintained a very strict banning over the import of 8 Japanese prefectures' fisher products. Well, I think that Japan has done all of very intensive efforts to pass through all the international standards, all the global investigations, whatever. But again, this is a matter of the internal politics, not just about satisfying the standards of global free trade associations. So yes, Japan has a very proactive needs to the export this fish product, and Ishiba tries to recover. It's recently very lackluster the supporting ratio, and Korea again. Particularly the leading party, has a very strong support groups in fishing and agriculture areas, and President Lee can ignore all these very desperate needs of our, the cultural, the agricultural and the fishery areas to protect, defend their current, the harvests. So I do expect a very strict and strong, the conflict and tension between two leaders over this issue. But I think even though this is a very sensitive political matter, those two leaders need to overcome this kind of very critical issues because they are well aware of very strict pressures from overseas, from Washington to overcome this international trade, the tariff. So they may measure the pros and cons of this issue, and that they need to satisfy the strong needs from Washington. And if they are so much confined with this internal domestic political, the agenda, they cannot have enough rooms, right, to enhance their the bargaining power in the talks with Washington. So they need to reduce their conflict, minimize their conflict between those two countries, because unless they have very strong ties for the alliances or the trading partners in dealing with the Washington needs, it'd be really tough for them to overcome the very strong pressure from Washington, because they need to be a team. Otherwise, the individual separate deals with Washington could cause a lot of troubles for their, the trade talk with Washington.
Right, and speaking of Washington, Dr. Kim, you mentioned that this year marks the 80th anniversary of the liberalization of Korea from Japanese colonial rule. And what's special about this visit, President Lee's visit to Tokyo, is that it comes ahead of his visit to Washington to meet President Donald Trump. And you said that through this visit, President Lee will be seeking some negotiation tips on how to handle the Trump administration. So what kind of tips in specific do you think he'll seek in terms of diplomatic and security issues, especially since Japan, as a neighboring country, has very similar situation with Korea, right?
Yes. I think sequencing and timing of President Lee's visit to Tokyo, followed by Washington's visit to Washington, demands our careful consideration in many regards. First, as you have mentioned, President Lee can seek negotiation tips from Prime Minister Ishiba because he has done it. And President Trump is known to have quite idiosyncratic negotiation style. He deeply seems to care about personal relationships. He doesn't want to get offended in public, just like President Zelensky did. Zelensky of Ukraine did during their meeting in Washington. And when the Ukraine president talked back and tried to resist by expressing disagreements, the meetings didn't go well. So I think Prime Minister Ishiba is going to talk to President Lee that try to be more personable with President Trump, try not to provoke him in public, but expect something unexpected during the negotiation. But another thing that we have to pay attention to is the possibility of Washington's reservations about the sequencing of the event, of the visit. In other words, if Japan and Korea come across as have formed united front to deal with Washington, Washington might have some reservations and concerns because the U.S. would not want Japan or Korea get too close, form a very strong bond, create a united front, which can challenge, in a way, Washington's wishes and commands. So when I think President Lee arrives at Washington, I think he needs to explain why he had to visit Tokyo before Washington by emphasizing these two major anniversaries. So by framing his visit and sequencing of it as very crucial momentum in history over these two important anniversary celebrations, he had to do something with Japan before visiting Washington. That would be justifiable. But if his sequencing of visit comes across as assertiveness or some sort of a declaration of autonomy in terms of foreign affairs, Seoul's conduction of foreign affairs, I don't think it's going to come across or will be taken too nicely by Washington. So a lot of explanations, a lot of personal times, getting to know the leader of the U.S. as a person. So those things I think he needs to pay attention to, and I think those are the points which Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba will also emphasize and deliver to President Lee. That's what I personally think. But who knows what these two leaders are going to talk about and talk to each other about comparing notes and sharing tips.
Right.
But as an observer, we can imagine certain scenarios and situations and how to smooth out those rough edges as they move along.
Right, we'll have to see how the summit talks turn out today. And on that note, Professor Kim, as you mentioned earlier, today's summit comes amid global uncertainties, especially as U.S. President Donald Trump imposed reciprocal tariffs on its trading partners, including Japan and South Korea. And you mentioned that economic cooperation between the two countries would be important to tackle this situation together, right?
Yeah. Because all the time the United States has urged clearly or very indirectly for Korean government to make a choice between China and the U.S. So that means the United States may want to organize a global supply chain and also the global the security chains in favor of their own the strategic plans. So, but for the past 20 years, 30 years, and Korea has been maintained a very neutral, standpoint between China and the United States. So we still insist that we will make money from Chinese market, where we will get closer to the United States for the sake of our national security. And that stance, all of a sudden has become very, very dangerous, a very unstable, strategic point for both of China and the United States. And who are now the strong allies for the United States? We can think about, the great UK and Japan and Australia. And absolutely, Korea has a very significant manufacturing, infrastructures and facilities, whereas the United States have very old and very rusty shipbuilding infrastructures. And that is one of the very critical reasons why the United States cannot ignore the Korean manufacturing facilities. Even though they impose Korean manufacturers, shipbuilders to move their factory turf back to the United States, but it's almost impossible to move all the manufacturing infrastructure to the territory of the United States. So, again, the main why President Lee decided to visit Japan first before he flies over to the United States, because he needs to satisfy, or he needs to, calm down the leaders of both the United States and Japan, that we may get closer to or join all those global strategic plans of the United States and Japan, including CPTPP. We have been very, very undecided, whether to join or not for the CPTPP. But the President Lee had clearly declared that we will join the CPTPP. So in terms of global security chains, and President Lee has declared we may favor the side of United States, the allies, and China may not be happy with this the issue. So, but again, the more significant issue for the Korean leader is on economic impact from about the tariffs, because we have new government, and he needs to clear all those concerns and worries for the economic progresses. We have struggled a little bit, for the past couple of years for loss export and increasing the inflation rates. So I think economic concerns have been major agenda for the President Lee's through all these couple of summits in Japan and Korea.
Right, absolutely. We'll have to see and see how the economic impact turns out for the summit today. And on that note, Dr. Kim, moving on to security issues, President Lee also talked about how the three-way cooperation between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan is important to achieve denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. How do you see this three-way security partnership?
Oh, the trilateral cooperation in order to deter North Korea. Nuclear North Korea is very, very important, because nuclear North Korea is the biggest and most fundamental threat to regional security. And in order to maintain regional order, the U.S. has the highest stake in maintaining the status quo, where North Korea does not dare to engage in provocative act by using those weapons of mass destruction. And South Korea, of course, is depending on our security, safety, stability, and our prosperity on the assumption of no war threat. So it is about our survival, success, and prosperity today and tomorrow, present and future. So South Korea has the biggest stake. And Japan, of course, is a nuclear weapons-free pacifist country, as its constitution clearly specifies. And Japan has to deter nuclear North Korea for the same reasons. So deterrence against nuclear North Korea engaging in provocative acts is the fundamental and basic assumption for all these three stakeholders: U.S. across the Pacific Ocean, and Japan and Korea, closest Northeast Asian allies, should work together in trilateral format. And one thing that we have to keep in mind is the closing distance between North Korea and Russia. As we know, North Korea has sent soldiers to the war front in order to assist Russia's warfare against Ukraine. And North Korea has been on the receiving end of assistance and technological transfer from the Russian side. So the relationship between these two countries are very, very close, getting very close. So we have to keep these power equation and dynamics in terms of security in the region in order to secure no war, peace, stability, predictable order, and maintenance of our daily life in relatively predictable and comfortable manner. So these things, I think, we should keep in mind. So the equation of security concerns, because of Pyongyang's narrowing distance with Moscow, is one big variable that we have to keep in mind in this equation of security relations in terms of trilateral coordination and cooperation.
Right, and do you think cooperation with Japan will also be important to get North Korea's Kim Jong-un back to the negotiating table?
I think so, because if South Korea alone wants to deal with or tries to deal with North Korea, it's not going to happen, because North Korea has been repeatedly saying so many times over the years that it doesn't care about what South Korea thinks. And recently, the statements and gestures coming from the Pyongyang leadership are getting more hawkish and more hostile towards Seoul. So Seoul alone will not be able to persuade Pyongyang to come to the negotiation table. So we need numbers, large numbers coming from our allies and friends. And Japan, of course, is one of the biggest stakeholders because Japan is in theory, according to its constitution, it's a pacifist country, even though it has many American military bases on its territory. Japan has to work with Seoul and persuade Pyongyang to come to the negotiation tables. And of course, Washington is the biggest variable consideration in order to persuade Kim Jong-un to come to the negotiation table. And you know what? Again, this is my personal speculation. I think the possibility of Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump getting together to revisit and to renegotiate nuclear North Korea is very, very likely and probable for various reasons. And one of the reasons, I think, has something to do with American president's ambition to win Nobel Peace Prize by mediating peace and by denuclearize North Korea. So these variables and these personal as well as public purposes and ambitions need to be considered when we try to deal with North Korea.
Right, and we are still waiting for the expanded talks between South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung and Japanese Prime Minister to begin. While we wait for that, Professor Yang, you earlier mentioned what kind of agendas will be economic agendas will be on the table today. Could you just briefly tell us more about that?
Well, I have a long list of the possible agenda for the talks between the two leaders. Well, first of all, as I already mentioned, they may start to talk about the balancing the overall supplies of semiconductors. Without this kind of, you may assume that you may concern or blame this kind of a cartel or trust, but they may try to, keep wholesome controls over the overall supply over semiconductor production. Because there is a big fluctuations all the time for the inventories of semiconductors without any global coordination of production in the plants. So they might want to keep the balance among those three countries, United States and Japan and Korea, to help the American semiconductor manufacturers recover their global competitiveness and also the very agile recovery of manufacturing facilities. Second one is, March this year, the Japan and the Korean, the ministers and the officers agreed to enhance their cooperation on the hydrogen and ammonia supply chains. In other words, the eco-economy. So keep this environment clean through this kind of the CO2-free, the energy sources. That could be another agenda. Number three, as I mentioned, they may work on the exploring and streamlining the overall global supply chains of critical minerals. Number four, they already agreed a couple of years ago, 2023 in June, to create the Korean and Japan, the currency swap. The currency swap means in case they are really out of the inventories of dollars, they may loan their local currencies, Korean won or Japanese yen to each other, so that both countries can recover the shortage of the global currencies to pay for their imports or whatever. So that could be another very, very interesting agenda. Another issue is they need to work on the global technology standards, because we are observing very fascinating and very, very, very fast and very, very, the crushing speed of new technology innovations. So without the global standards, including particularly for those tripartite partnership, I mean, if the three countries, develop their own product without any global standards, those devices may not work compatibly. That may cause a lot of havoc in the end users market. So development of global standard could be another agenda for this cooperation. We already talked about CPTPP, etc. There are too many agendas that need to talk.
Right, a lot of economic agenda there indeed.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, ahead of the president's departure, National Security Advisor Ri Sung-rak on Friday briefed reporters on the key agenda items and focus of his visits. Our presidential office correspondent Song Yoo-jin reports.
Back-to-back summits with South Korea's key partners. President Lee Jae-myung heads to his first stop, Japan, on Saturday. So, what will be on the agenda? National Security Advisor Ri Sung-rak told reporters on Friday that the two leaders will address shared challenges and discuss practical ways to cooperate. Trade uncertainties triggered by the Trump administration and North Korea's nuclear threats could also be on the agenda. But the summit itself holds great significance.
The two leaders agreed in June to swiftly resume frequent leader-level diplomacy. We hope President Lee's visit to Japan will further deepen the personal bonds and trust between them.
Lee says this could also create a virtuous cycle to discuss thornier issues such as historical disputes. As for President Lee's first summit with U.S. President Donald Trump, the top security advisor called it a meeting with challenges. He outlined three goals: stabilizing Seoul and Washington's economic and trade partnership under last month's framework agreement, modernizing the alliance, and exploring new ways of cooperation. On trade, details of South Korea's investment pledge within the framework are expected to be nailed down.
Investment will likely be discussed further at the South Korea-U.S. summit. Both sides are aware of this, and we've already proposed a range. I don't expect much difficulty in this. I think the upcoming summit will produce a mutually beneficial investment package.
On security, we emphasized modernizing the South Korea-U.S. alliance by further reinforcing their joint defense posture. Washington could also press Seoul to boost defense spending, while the two presidents may discuss resuming dialogue with North Korea. And when it comes to fresh areas of cooperation, nuclear energy, shipbuilding, AI, and semiconductors are expected to be on the table. With President Lee describing trilateral cooperation among South Korea, the U.S., and Japan as the axis of diplomacy, the presidential office says Seoul is ready to show its commitment to working more closely with the two, which share the values of freedom and democracy. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang.News.
And President Lee Jae-myung has made Japan his first overseas stop before heading to Washington. Now, this visit marks the resumption of the so-called shuttle diplomacy with Tokyo, as well as its initiative to strengthen three-way cooperation with the United States. Our Oh Soo-young reports.
President Lee Jae-myung has underscored his push to stabilize bilateral ties with Japan and bolster trilateral cooperation with the United States. As the president visits Tokyo before Washington, D.C., a diplomatic analyst told Arirang.News that the move is unprecedented for a South Korean leader, sending a message to both Japan and the U.S.
In the past, Korea-Japan relations were largely seen as a bilateral issue, but it has become increasingly apparent that good relations are necessary for solid Korea-U.S. ties. So, demonstrating that Korea-Japan shuttle diplomacy is functioning well can be a useful card for Korea with regard to the U.S.
Lee's Japan trip not only marks a strong break from the tradition of new Korean leaders heading to the White House first, it also stands out as past progressive presidents prioritized Beijing over Tokyo as the second capital of outreach. Tokyo officials had feared that the new Korean leader might adopt an anti-Japan stance, revisiting historical sticking points. However, Lee's remarks since his inauguration, pledging continuity and improving bilateral ties, have now been put into action, with the resumption of top-level shuttle diplomacy, reciprocal visits between Seoul and Tokyo.
His recent interview with the Yomiuri Shimbun elaborates on his approach. If you look closely, he said he will accept past intergovernmental accords, such as on the issue of comfort women and wartime forced labor reached during conservative administrations. That is something that reassures the Japanese government.
And according to Dr. Kim Suk-hyun, the newspaper devoted 9 full pages to the interview, a rare gesture that shows how seriously Japan views the South Korean outreach. Lee further expressed hope for a new breakthrough declaration with Japan, inspired by the 1998 Kim Dae-jung Obuchi Declaration, when Japan expressed remorse for its brutal colonial rule, while Korea pledged a new era of bilateral ties.
Aside from discussing security cooperation within the Trilateral framework with the U.S. and the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, economic cooperation will likely be the main priority, supported by cultural and people-to-people exchange, while historical disputes are handled separately.
Seoul is set to name a new ambassador to Japan, Lee Hyuk, a veteran diplomat who served 3 terms in Tokyo, providing further impetus towards building a future-oriented relationship.
Rather than sending a political figure with limited knowledge of Japan, appointing a seasoned diplomat shows President Lee's practical approach to shaping bilateral relations.
Kim says the Tokyo visit now sets the stage for critical talks in Washington, likely to touch upon trilateral cooperation, along with trade, defense cooperation, and handling North Korea. Oh Soo-young, Arirang
We are still waiting to carry live scenes from Japan as the delegation from Seoul, led by President Lee Jae-myung, visited Tokyo today. And Dr. Kim, while we wait for that, it's the first time in 2 years that a South Korean president is visiting Japan, and his first visit to Tokyo since his inauguration in early June, right? And it's unusual for a Korean leader to meet the Japanese prime minister before meeting the U.S. president. Could you tell us more about the significance of this visit?
Yes. Today, we are witnessing a very symbolic and practical history in its making. And what do I mean by practical and symbolic? Practical, I think, is one point that we need to understand, emphasize, because both leaders of Korea and Japan are trying to transcend, go beyond the difficult past that has been binding the 2 countries' rocky relationship. By pursuing economic cooperation and security coordination and emphasis on those 2 areas, while not forgetting or relegating those lingering historical issues, both countries are trying to pursue pragmatic diplomatic relationship by holding summit talks today in Tokyo in the commemoration of 2 very important historical events: 80th anniversary of Korea's liberation from Japanese colonial rule and 60th anniversary of the normalization of relations between 2 countries. So that's practical term. And what do I mean by symbolic term? Symbolic term, it has future-oriented messages in terms of suggesting directionality of these 2 countries are expected to pursue. Symbolic means we are not going to forget about the past grievances, but we are not going to hold grudges against each other. By letting it go, we begin to see the symbolic significance of today's meeting. So that's why today's Lee-Ishiba meeting can be very, very important history in its making in our bilateral history as well as our future diplomatic relationship. And today's meeting and the narrowing of the gap in terms of different perceptions over historical issues can send a message to the U.S. that it doesn't have to intervene or give out advice to the 2 countries over the past issues. We can handle and revisit and we can try to resolve those issues on our own. So it can be symbolic statement which can be sent to Washington by expressing and showing our capacity, our willingness, and our future-oriented directions by envisioning what the 2 neighboring countries in Northeast Asia can accomplish together. So in answering your very, very important question, today's meeting, I think, is going to leave a very significant mark in both countries' history.
Right, a very significant historic meeting indeed. And Professor Yang, shortly we will be seeing President Lee meet with Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba in Tokyo. What would you say is the #1 economic goal that President Lee Jae-myung tries to achieve through his summit with Ishiba?
Well, through his interviews with Japan newspapers, I think he made a couple issues very, very straightforward and explicit. The first one is he may pursue very dramatic and unprecedented economic cooperation with Japan. And second one is he very seriously and significantly considers to join CPTPP. So those two are very, very sensitive because the issues, because it involves with the domestic political matters as well. But we should keep in mind that about 6 years ago, and in the year 2019, those two countries used to suffer a lot, due to very political reasons, actually the international political reasons. So we banned actually the import of Japanese raw materials, but this significant tensions was diluted, and normal relationship has recovered in 4 years, in the year 2023. But now they want to enhance this cooperation a lot more and better, due to mainly the external pressures from Washington. So they need to work very hard, enhance the level of cooperations, because that's exactly what I think the Trump wants. Because, again, the Trump Washington is very seriously considers about the reactions of China. So he wants to strengthen and enhance the ties among the Far East, the Asian countries with the Japan and Korea. So that's why the Trump all the time urged our government to make the big choice between China and the United States. So we have a long agenda to discuss with the Japan, such as collaboration of supply chains of raw materials and the production, the scales of the batteries and the semiconductors, and the financial stability, because we already created about $10 billion worth of the swap contract between two currencies. We also need to talk about enhancing the tour industries, because already in the first half, Japan has invited over 20 million visitors for their tourist market. So, and it'd be very nice if the countries cooperate very well to take advantage of our K-pop attractiveness and for the tourists to Japan. And CPTPP and global standards developed together for the sake of enhancing attractiveness of our products and devices, etc. So all these issues may be put on the table. And the fact that this meeting is being delayed means I think they may come back and forth between their domestic political matters, such as the fishery import, and also enhancing their global cooperations to cope with the tariff, the pressures from the Washington. So yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised to observe this meeting is being delayed pretty much. Yeah, they must be working very hard.
Right, right. And Dr. Kim, on that note, while we wait for the meeting to begin, what diplomatic and security agendas might be discussed at the summit today?
Oh, diplomatic agendas, I think, will put a big emphasis on closer coordination. As you have mentioned previously, this revival of shuttle diplomacy, where leaders of both countries stay very closely engaged with each other, communicating with each other on a regular basis. When a contingency takes place, we are not far from each other. I mean, it takes 1 or 2 hours, by flight,
right,
to stay engaged. So structural diplomacy, I think, will be one of the issues.
Dr. Kim, I will have to interrupt you for a second there. I've just been told President Lee has now entered the venue. We see on the screen President Lee Jae-myung shaking hands with Prime Minister Ishiba, and it appears the expanded talks will begin shortly. We'll come back right afterwards.
Well, thank you for waiting. I sincerely welcome the visit of President Lee Jae-myung, and it is a great delight to have the chance to see you in person and have talks. Peace and security does not come for free. If we don't do any actions, it would not be materialized. It does not come automatically. And since we are amidst many difficulties, it is even more true.
同時に地域全体の利益にもなるものであります。また日本、韓国、アメリカ、この連携の強化も非常に重要だと思っております。このような点について大統領と認識を共有できることは本当に喜ばしいことであります。
Japan and Korea, the relations, an enhancement of the relations is not only for the North Korea relations, but it is also important for the regional cooperation. And it is very important that we strengthen the cooperation. And I'm very delighted that I am standing alongside with President Lee.
チョ・ヒョン外務大臣外交部長官が来日をされました。私も会談をさせていただき、外務大臣も会談をさせていただいているわけでございますが、日韓政府間の意思疎通が極めて緊密に行われてきております。大統領の就任後初の二国間の訪問先が日本ということになりますのは、国交正常化後60年になりますが初めてであると承知いたしております。現下非常に厳しい戦略環境の下で大統領がそのように日本に最初にご訪問いただくということが大変に心強いことであります。これから先非常に良い形でシャトル外交というものが実践されるということを希望し、そしてまたこのスタートとして大統領がご支援いただいたということを本当にこれからよろしく思っております。
And after your inauguration, the foreign minister of Korea visited in July, and I also met him. And the communication between the two governments as such that is very close is taking place. And the Korean president visiting Japan as his first stop after his inauguration, I understand that it is the first time. And under this strategic cooperation, I am very delighted, and I feel very delighted that it is your first visit. And with this as a start, I hope that our relations would advance. I sincerely hope that it advances. So I hope to exchange many of our thoughts today. Thank you, Prime Minister, for your hospitality.
제가 전에 이런 표현을 했는데
Well, I once used this expression that Korea and Japan
같이 쓰는 이웃과 같은
are neighbors sharing their backyards.
前に私は韓国と日本の関係は前の庭を共有する隣人のような関係だということを申し上げました。
서로 많은 것들을 공유하고 있고
We share many things,
협력할 분야도
and
많고
we have so many areas of cooperation. And on the other hand, since we're too close to each other, there are some conflicts that are unnecessary that arises.
さまざまなことを共有しており、協力できる分野も多くありますけれども、一方で近いがゆえに不必要な対立ができることも事実です。
사람들 사이의 관계처럼
So just like people-to-people relations, relations between countries, there are points of conflicts, points of complementary, and points of cooperation.
国と国との関係の中にも対立的な要素や協力的な要素、また補完できる要素があると思います。
서로 좋은 면들을
So we
공유하고
would have to complement each other on the good things, and for the things that are shortcoming, we can cooperate on that as well. And that would be the ideal relations between the two neighboring countries.
必要なことを調整をし、必要なことが得られるように協力することこそ隣国の協力の関係の在り方だと思います。
어려운 문제는 어려운 문제대로
Difficult issues could be taken care of as they are, and some issues that are almost impossible to tackle, that also could be taken care of. And in the areas that we can cooperate, we can cooperate, and that will be what the political circles of the two countries should do.
として扱って解決に向かわせアプローチすることが非常に難しい問題であればそれはまた時間をかけて考慮をし一方で協力できる分野では協力することが両国の国民のより良い生活のために両国の政治の世界がやるべきことではないかと思います。
In particular, recently, the trade issues or security issues, as well as international orders, it is in a tumultuous era. And Korea and Japan, since we share a very common ground and common perspective to it, I think we would have to cooperate even more to tread those difficult waters.
価値や秩序、そして体制、理念が似ていて立場を共有している韓国と日本がいつにも増して協力する、その協力を強化するタイミングなのではないかと思います。
So, more than any time in the past, the communication and cooperation between our two countries is necessary, and it will profit us. And together with Prime Minister and our officials between the two countries, I hope that they will have cooperation and communications in earnest.
の対話や意思疎通が必要な時期であって協力を通じて得られるものが多い時期でありますのでシャトル外交などを通じて総理と私の間でそして日本の政府と韓国の政府のさまざまなレベルで多角的な対話そして協力が行われることができればと思います。
As the Prime Minister said, it is the first time that Republic of Korea President pays visit to Japan as his first stop after inauguration, and that really emphasizes how important we think Japan is in our diplomacy.
二国間関係で日本を単独することは今回が初めてのようですので、それを考えますとそれぐらい韓国政府が韓日関係を重要視しているということをご理解いただければと思います。
Prime Minister has much interest in balanced growth of the nation. So I hope that when you come to Korea next time as a shuttle diplomacy, I hope to welcome you not in Seoul but in some other cities in Korea.
ご関心があるというふうに承知をしておりますけれども、シャトル外交の一環としてもし総理が韓国をご訪問なさる機会があれば、今回はソウルではなく韓国の地方の方でお目にかかっていくことができればと思います。
And since I'm seeing you for the second time, I really feel very close to you as if we're friends, and I look forward to today's talks.
今回お会いすることが2回目ですけれども、2回目であるだけに非常に近しい友人のような気がしてなりません。本日の会談を通じて対話をよく行いまして、いい関係となることを期待しております。
報道大使願います。
Now that was our live footage from Tokyo of the opening remarks by President Lee Jae-myung and Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba ahead of the actual summit between the two leaders. Now, that being said, Professor Yang, we just heard President Lee Jae-myung and Prime Minister Ishiba speak on bilateral relations, including trade. What are your thoughts on their comments with regard to their summit?
Well, I can sense their meeting. It starts with a very smooth and very friendly atmosphere. But both leaders are well aware that they have their own individual issues to resolve with Washington. And also there are other issues they need to break through and enhance through this summit meeting. Well, for example, the Korean government is well aware that they still have a long way to go to overcome the tariff pressures from Washington. We still have tariff issues for steel and aluminum because the tariff, the rate is above 50%. And also we agreed to invest over $350 billion for new technologies and agreed to purchase $100 billion of new energies from the United States. Long way to go to finish this, the deals over the tariff issues. So both countries are well aware that they have their own agenda and for this particular summit. So I do believe that this is the right time for those two leaders to enhance their cooperations, because unless they work as a team to satisfy the needs from Washington, they will suffer a lot to overcome these tariff pressures.
Right, absolutely. We can clearly see that the two sides are trying to work together to enhance bilateral relations.
Yeah.
And on that note, Dr. Kim, what are your thoughts on the President and the Prime Minister's comments?
Oh, I like to agree with Professor Yang's observation that they were very friendly. They were off to a good start. And I was able to make a couple of observations by watching the footage. The first one I thought interesting was Prime Minister Ishiba's opening remarks. He said, peace and security is not free. And I think he was paraphrasing, freedom is not free. The expression which is etched on the stone installed at the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. I don't know whether Prime Minister Ishiba intended it that way or not, but by paraphrasing freedom is not free expression, which we can find in Washington, D.C. over the American support and sacrifice for the sake of liberty and freedom of the Korean people. Ishiba's statement that peace and security is not free, I thought was multi-layered. He was targeting at multi-audience, both in Korea, in Japan, as well as the US. And the second thing that I observed was that Prime Minister Ishiba emphasized cooperation. He didn't talk much. The key word in his remarks was cooperation. And then President Lee picked it up and he elaborated on it by presenting 3 discernible areas of cooperation, such as there are topics that are impossible to deal with, that we are going to handle it that way. And second category is difficult issues, then we are going to handle it accordingly. And finally, manageable issues that we are going to cooperate to address those. So by observing the two leaders interacting with each other on the concept of cooperation, I think Prime Minister Ishiba and President Lee are very, very good pair. Prime Minister Ishiba drops a big concept, and President Lee picked it up and elaborated on it with details. If these two leaders can work like that in the coming years, I think Korea and Japan are going to do much better than before. And the final thing that I observed was the distinguishable personality traits between these two leaders. I mean, we could tell that Prime Minister Ishiba was not talking much. He is taciturn. His posture is stern. He's austere. While President Lee is articulate, explanatory, he's personable, and he's very bright. So these two personality traits, in terms of differences and potential complementarity between these two leaders in terms of their perceptions and postures in handling things, I think these two men can work together and complement on each other. And I think both Korea and Japan are really off to a good start. And I have become much more hopeful and optimistic now than this morning.
Right, that's very good to hear. And cooperation was definitely the key word from the two leaders, right? Mm-hmm. All right, Dr. Kim, thank you so much for your insight today. And Professor Yang, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. On that note, we end our special live coverage today. Thank you for watching.
There is no greater blessing than to have